Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Wow, there's a good group here. I was about to say we're going to have a conversation about this incredible book, but perhaps we're all here for some therapy. Well, welcome to a conversation about Rise, a pop history of Asian America from the 90s to now. And we've got a fantastic panel for you. It's all three of the talented and brilliant authors of this incredible book. Of course, Jeff Yang, author, journalist, writer, and Hudson's dad.
Hudson's dad.
Probably get that a lot.
Only get that these days, but, working on it.
Yeah. And Phil Yu, who's the creator, the mastermind behind Angry Asian Man, the blog, and Philip Wang, who is the founder and co-founder of Wong Fu Productions. Welcome all. Thanks so much for joining us. So where do we begin? I think we begin right where the book does. I know you've answered this question many times, which is, how did this all begin? Where did you get the inspiration to do it? The incredible part is you have written this book and have gotten contributors within 2 years during a pandemic, a lockdown. So yeah, let's start there. How did it all begin?
There's that whole alleged anecdote that Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the plague years, and
are you comparing us to Shakespeare right now? Pause. No.
I know,
but the plague.
Shakespeare cannot really compete with
though,
it.
Yeah.
But 500 pages is a lot of stuff to write, and actually having 2 years of lockdown, not to say that there was a silver lining to a global pandemic that took millions of lives, but there is a sense in which the very fact that we were being faced with the enclosure of quarantine, the sort of rising tide of what felt like a ceaseless barrage of anti-Asian hostility and abuse and bigotry coming from the highest levels of government. These are all things which really helped coalesce for us the need for this book. And to be fair, we had been talking about it before everything went into deep freeze. We'd actually had a lot of conversations between and among us about the fact that this 3-decade period that we thought was so pivotal, one in which we came of age and saw so much change in our community, was largely invisible. And I mean, actually, it's something which Philip, in fact, in particular, called out to me. I think we were on a bus ride.
Yeah, I think it was something that I've never thought about this, like all this content as a book. It was just stuff that we talked about, and I was lamenting to Jeff how we love Crazy Rich Asians. We love what it did for representation in Hollywood, and it definitely had a positive impact. But I couldn't help but notice during that time when it was coming out, like in 2018, that all these headlines were celebrating, oh my God, first movie with Asian people in 25 years, or first movie since Joy Luck Club, and it was as if there was nothing in between. But there was so much that happened in those 25 years that our community did, that we as individuals did, that our peers did, and we just thought, man, it's unless someone writes those articles, no one's ever going to know about all those achievements that we know was there, that we lived through ourselves. So it was things that we just talked about, but it was Jeff that had the idea of, hey, why don't we turn this into a book? And I just thought, sure, okay. I didn't know what that would entail, but yeah, I'm down to help out. I did not think it was going to turn into this 500 pages.
If I recall correctly, the original proposal for the book was somewhere around 300 pages, right?
Yes.
And now it's 500. So during the process, the stuff that we said we have to include this, it ballooned bigger and bigger over time. Yeah.
Jeff bamboozled us,
tricked us into writing this book. Yeah.
I'm glad you bamboozled them, because I want to say, and I should have said this before we began the program, but thank you so much for this gift and this love letter to our community. This is exactly what would have helped me growing up, as that awkward Asian queer person, in the I guess 90s and 2000s, right? It probably would have saved me a lot of money from therapy. And I want to say, just leaving this on my coffee table and just seeing people who look like me and these amazing people who've contributed so much, that helped. And then it also helped whoever came over, just kept touching it and picking it up, and it opened up so many conversations. So tell us, how you got so many people to contribute in the amount of time that you did, and then what was the strategy behind choosing, who you were going to include, or how you were going to go about asking them, what to say, what to write.
I think that a lot of the early part of this book was just the three of us sitting in front of open windows, in Google Docs, just harvesting our brains and thinking of everything and everybody who was meaningful to us and who we either wanted to speak about, or bring into the book as contributors. And I mean, it was just hours at a time. We just sit there on Zoom or on conference calls saying, you remember that? Oh yeah, what about that and that and that and that? Thus 500 pages, but.
It was definitely a case where we were like, if we had this book growing up, what would we want to see in this? Like, what was important to us, Because the thing about history is that when you're living it, you don't really know that it's history. It's just like the stuff you experienced and the things that were important to you. And we thought, like, if we were trying to, in some way, canonize all those people and ideas and happenings, what would we want what would we want in this book? What would we want to have in our fingertips as we flip the pages? So it was as simple as that.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And I think the other part of it of assembling the team, if you were, like, of our contributors and the people we wanted involved, a lot of it was like, we could get them. Like, should we? I want to talk to this person. Like, do you think we could get them? I bet we could. I bet they would want. And I bet they want to tell their story. I bet no one's asked them about their story. Like, let's get them. And so it was a lot. There was a lot of dreaming involved in the beginning. Yeah.
It was definitely not very scientific. I think a lot of people think like, wow, this is so comprehensive. It's all so, like, you guys covered so many things, and it really was just us just imagining and thinking, oh yeah, remember that? It helped that we had someone that literally kept a blog of just all the happenings of everything, and Jeff, with his magazine as well. To your point about not realizing that you're living history until, like, you're past it, as the one that was supposed to come in as the 2010s, I guess, correspondent, it was also weird for me to think like, oh, what I just did like 5 years ago is now history. Oh my God! But that was essentially what we had to do, is kind of try to have this vision of, okay, in 10 years, in 15 years, what should we hope is preserved, and what do we feel like could be forgotten if we don't mention it. And just to your point too about, like, all the different contributors, we were very, very aware from the get-go that we are three cis East Asian men that were, in charge of this book, and we wanted to be very, very conscious right from the get-go of, okay, we need to bring in other perspectives. We need to tell or look into topics that weren't necessarily our personal experience, but we know was a thing in maybe other sub-communities or groups within our monolithic Asian American banner, right? So that was something that was very important to us. And even as we were going through that Google Doc of just throwing things around, we started making note of, oh, this is starting to look too much like representation here. Let's try to balance it out with making sure that this piece gets in there. So that's where it kind of became a little bit more scientific, yeah.
And that's why it's 500 pages.
And many more versions to come, I'm sure. Well, you do split the book up, and it's structured in a way where you go through the decades, the 90s and then 2000s and 2010. So why don't we do that? We'll start with 1990, and I'll read just a little bit from Jeff. This is from you. That you start off with, I was born in 1968. I'm starting with that because since I first became aware of it, I've always been a little bit haunted by the fact that I was born in the same year as Asian America itself. And when I read that, I got the chills. Let's talk about that. What did you mean by that?
So Asians have been in America since before there was an America, right? There were Filipinos who jumped off of galleon ships and swam across to the mainland of what would become America. There were Vietnamese who came early. There were people who were sojourners and even early settlers, right? Long before there was even the idea that America would become a place where many people would be welcome from many different nations of many different colors and backgrounds and races and nationalities. And yet, being Asian in America does not make you Asian American, right? This is something which we contend with across our communities and even across generations. My parents don't really think of themselves as Asian American. They are Taiwanese, Taiwanese American, sometimes just American when they are asserting that they're Americans. But Asian American is a bit of a bridge too far for them. And the idea, the language around Asian America is kind of a relatively recent vintage. 1968 actually was the year in which the term Asian American was created very close to here. Berkeley, California, and also at SFSU, there were third world liberation strikes and protests, and a group of Asian Americans, before they were Asian American, a group of Asian students who were protesting on behalf, actually, of Huey Newton, the jailed Black Panther, wanted to march alongside the Afro-American students who were creating the Rally for His Freedom. And they didn't have a literal banner to march under. So they created a banner. They painted a banner. And on that banner, it said, the Asian American Political Alliance. And we never think about simple acts like creating a banner, making signs, creating symbols, as having ripple effects that can change entire communities. But that did, because shortly after the first use of that term, the term became readily used across academia, across government, across policy. By 1972, there were bills being passed, or not passed, as the case may be, in Congress using the term Asian American. There was specifically a bill designed to try to create a sort of Asian American bureau that would address the growing issues surrounding the Asian demographic in America. And what that meant was, for all intents and purposes, this term, which was created as kind of a term of art or convenience, was going to have some kind of meaning for us. It was a box we'd have to check at some point for the rest of our lives.
I do want to add to that also, my parents didn't really think of themselves as Americans. They always thought of themselves as refugees, as they are. They're refugees from Laos, but they didn't see that until they had to check a box that said Asian American. Phil, thoughts on the 90s?
It's interesting. I always say one thing about what Jeff just said. I read an interesting quote from someone who attended the meeting where they came up with that name, Asian American Pacific Political Alliance. Somebody said, I went into that meeting, it was like some apartment in Berkeley. I went into that meeting and I was Oriental. When I came out, I was Asian American. And I always thought that was such an interesting, it's almost a religious moment, right? But the way I always see it also is that the term Asian American, the identity Asian American, is it's an opt-in identity. It's a voluntary identity, right? Like Jeff said, his parents don't consider themselves Asian American. And I think for a long time myself, I didn't know what Asian American really meant. It was just the box you checked off on applications and things like that. I think at some point in my life, I opted into the idea that you are Asian American, and what that means is you're joining in with this, whatever that means, and whatever the burdens and the responsibilities that come with it. And so it is something that you have to choose to be Asian American,
I don't think when in the 90s, I was in elementary school into high school. Why are the groans, guys? Come on. But what I just to your point about you have to opt in, I felt like actually in the 90s and thankfully growing up in the East Bay in the Bay Area here, I felt I opted into AZN before Asian American. I didn't even think about my Asian American likeness because I was thankfully around, even though I grew up in a predominantly white suburb, Walnut Creek, shout out to 925, which I still have the area code on my phone. But yeah, like I was very lucky that my parents put me around other Asian families and I had Asian friends, and I never felt the feeling that I was lesser because of my Asianness. And so when there was, if anyone remembers, like there was this late 90s, early 2000s period where like there was this Asian pride era. It was a whole look. And I felt a lot of pride being Asian. And I actually feel like that me not having that chip on my shoulder allowed me to create unapologetically, allowed me to be myself in spaces and not worry how other people were looking at me. And I think it's why the content and from Wong Fu and that I was able to pull from for this book was able to exist because, the lens I had was coming from a place where I never felt othered specifically for my race. It was maybe just for me being weird or something, which I don't know if that's better or worse. But yeah, anyways.
Can I add about the ASEAN thing? We have this book comes in an audiobook form, and our narrators do a fantastic job. Where there's like 3 or 4, and we read our own essays. But the ASEAN section, it's really hard to hear. To listen to if you don't see the actual words and the way the typography works with ASEAN stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then the narrator, he doesn't say ASEAN, he says Asian, like, and I'm like, oh, you're not getting it quite right, man. Like, anyway,
I don't know if for those of you who, like myself, did not grow up really through that era, there was an era defined by AOL Instant Messenger and handles of things like, Lil Asian Foxy Gal with capital A's and 3's instead of E's and stuff like that. And I mean, I'm not mocking your culture.
You're trying real. I'm so offended right now.
But you can tell the audio book of this is all of a sudden a little bit filtered through the challenges of turning what is essentially a graphic medium into something that is audible.
But I think the fact that we have this span of 3 decades is what makes this book really so wonderful. Is that I got to learn a lot, like from Jeff, like that, even that whole history lesson of 1968. I didn't know about that, and I get to teach him about the ASEAN culture. But I think that actually shows, like, that's why the book is so great in showing just how much progress we actually have made. That I definitely acknowledge and recognize that. My generation and even your generation sits on the progress of previous people's work and previous communities and previous movements. And honestly, like it's what I hope, just people can feel that progress when they read through it in order. Yeah.
I'm just going to say that my younger son, who's 14, was like, Dad, what's an import tuner model? And I was like, you have to ask Uncle Phil.
I totally thought that part of me, that secret historical data of the screen name, ASEAN, sweet Asian girl, 17.
I can't believe we're talking about that
at
in
the
the
time.
Commonwealth Club right now.
I thought that was going to be a secret. I never was going to divulge. Thanks, guys, for this book. Anyway, let's talk about 90s, pop culture. I'm really glad that you included Margaret Cho in this book. Yay, Margaret, yeah. And I really do feel like we should stop and just talk about that because Margaret Cho did, change TV in a lot of ways.
She did. And in some ways, I changed Margaret Cho, and I talk about it in the introduction. It's something which even this day kind of haunts me, but at the time when Margaret's show was being crafted, right? All American Girl, it was going to be the first network primetime sitcom featuring an all-Asian cast. It was going to be focused on Margaret Cho, this incredible, just rising star in the stand-up comedy world, brash, bold, queer, body, all in all places. And it was just so exciting to me. I knew her from the community. I was friends with her. She announced that the show was being picked up from pilot at a stand-up comedy event that I'd helped produce in New York City. And so I had this investment in it, as I think many of us did. So many Asian Americans who were planning, watch parties for when All American Girl finally would hit the screen. And then the reality hit that at the time I was TV critic for The Village Voice. And even though I was a junior critic, the only non-white, in fact, only non-white, non-white male critic, there were no female critics, it was white male critics, and then there was me. I got the opportunity or the assignment to write my first featured review, and it was of All American Girl. And I looked at the videotape, this VHS tape. For those of you guys who do not know what a VHS tape is,
Dude, I know what a VHS is.
My parents owned a video store, my friend. My parents are sitting right there, and they owned a video store.
Hi, parents. Yeah.
well, videotapes back in the day contained, maybe a couple of hours worth of content, and in this case, it had the first 3 episodes of All American Girl. And I was handed it and told my editor said, okay, this is your big chance. You can do this cover review on All American Girl. It looks like it's going to be important. And I said, yeah, I know it's important, but I feel a little bit compromised, like I have a conflict of interest, not just because I know Margaret, but because I want this show to succeed. And if it's not good, I don't know what I'm going to do. And my editor, also a white man, said, you have to actually make a decision. Is your job more important than being friends with celebrities, right? Do you actually feel like you can professionally address this, or do I have to assign this to somebody who probably will have a take that is even more distanced and even more kind of problematic on some level? And so with that kind of galvanizing me, I took it home, I watched those first 3 episodes, and they weren't good, or more importantly, they weren't Margaret, right? What I thought was going to be on screen, I don't know what I thought it was going to be, because it was going to be at 8:30 after Home Improvement on ABC. And, Tim the Tool Guy and then Margaret Cho. I mean, obviously there was going to be some sort of coming together in the middle. But I wrote my review, and my review was harsh. And I think I actually compared the show to like a proof of life video, with Margaret sort of like hostage within this format that did not reflect her or her comedy. And the next day, she literally she called me up and said, "I heard the reviews. How can you fax it to me?" I'm like, "Oh my god!" And I did. And she called me up almost immediately afterwards and said, "I was afraid that it was going to be a negative review. I didn't know how negative it was going to be. I'm telling you right now, when they cancel this show, they're going to throw this on the table and say, this is the only guy, the only Asian American TV critic in America. Even your community doesn't support this. Why should we?" And she wasn't entirely wrong. That's kind of what happened. So, this whole fallow period for Asian American primetime television, that happened after that cancellation, it was a lot. It was a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you even say on here that, the end of the era, and then we kind of go into, I guess, a really long time until primetime will even consider and take up another show that's focused on an Asian American family, and we'll talk about that a little later.
Yes.
But yeah, Phil, your thoughts on 90s Asian American TV?
I look at, so 90s is when I was in high school in the 90s, and I look at that moment in time where it was like All American Girl and the Joy Luck Club, Dragon the Bruce Lee Story, very important movie to me. Mulan, Vanishing Sun. These are all like little moments where it's just like, I grew up watching television, just looking anywhere for like an Asian face, and you would just note that it's marked by such scarcity that I'll just take anything I can get, and I think that is what really kind of defines that era. And so we actually focus a lot about a lot of pop culture moments in the 90s because that's all we had, and so these little moments were lifted up as our icons and our heroes. We had an extended discussion on whether or not Dante Bosco as Rufio in Hook was like an important character, and it was me and Philip like trying to convince Jeff like, no, that is a big. There's a lot of things throughout the book where it was like the two of us in combination telling the third person, no, this is a big deal. We need to put it in the book.
Did anyone listen to Bizarre Love Triangle?
Come on.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
I think Todd is here. Right? Yeah.
There you go.
Todd Inouye, folks. He actually wrote that piece about the critical importance of essentially mostly British synthesizer-driven pop music to a certain generation, a certain cohort of Asian Americans back in the 1990s. And
Which I had to be put on. I had to be educated.
Now you
on.
know.
Now I know.
now you know.
Now I know.
Take a break from my questions, and we have a couple questions from our audience. Thank you. How can art help create allyship among communities of color?
I'll field that first because I think that one of the things that art does when it's done right is it challenges us to be more human. It takes us out of those boxes that we have had to check off all our lives and forces us to empathize with other stories and with other narratives and with other positions. And I think one of the things that, even as a critic all these years, has become more and more apparent to me is that the ability to simply just sit in a seat and look at somebody else's story and project yourself into it humanizes them in a way that almost nothing else does. I mean, I don't know if you guys are on Twitter, God forbid, but there's a lot of conversation on Twitter, especially right now, because there's this movie Turning Red out there, incredibly Asian Canadian movie about this, about girls and puberty and the changes that occur to one's mindset and one's body. And this white critic wrote extensively about how exhausting it was to simply watch this thing that he felt he was not reflected in. And the very first thing that every Asian American, every person of color, most women, across the internet was like, we are exhausted every day. That's all we see is pictures of you. And if this one thing that we have, you are exhausted by, what does that mean for the rest of us, right? So I do think that when we engage properly, when we engage with pop culture on that empathic level, it changes everything about us.
Just to add to that too, I think just art and media too, it's a way to expose people to communities and people and stories that you normally wouldn't have in your daily life, that are not in your immediate circles and maybe just not available to you. So I think like a lot of times people, for them to see some of these stories are our faces or someone from a different community, it has to be in fiction first. Even though it's someone else's reality, at least in your world, I have to consume it as a fictional piece or maybe a documentary or something like that. But basically, come into my world or something, or come into my scope so I can understand, so that when I actually do venture out there and search for allyship or experienced intersections, then it becomes like less foreign to us, I guess. So I think like a lot of times, even for me personally, that's what I enjoy, looking out for stories and content that is not necessarily from within my own, I guess, sphere.
I think one of the central questions of this book, and also our own respective works over the years, has been who gets to tell our stories? Who gets to have agency and ownership over about how our stories are told, and who gets to tell them, and what stories are told. And I mean, when it comes to Asians in America, like for too often and for too long, like it was just other people on the outside looking in, like making up stories, honestly, in a lot of ways. And so a lot of this is trying to reclaim that, and a lot of that was like saying like we want to tell this story ourselves, and what is the story, And so the book is an attempt at that, I think.
The best clapback on that Turning Red tweet was like the people saying, "I'm so glad you could relate to a talking rat and fish more than a girl in Canada, Asian girl in Canada."
There were a couple things about the book that I had thoughts validated how it felt for a really long time. One of the things that came up for me was just how many people that we didn't even consider Asian American or Asian at all, and that I would be like, oh, I had no idea Naomi Campbell, is Asian, and I think that goes back to like just being erased sometimes, right, in pop culture and the media. And then a couple other things that also came up for me was the history, that it wasn't just like we were saying, we're identifying people who are Asian, we're claiming them, but that we have real true history in this country, like, for example, even in music and the cross-cultural solidarity work that we've been doing for so long in music. So when people talk about like Asians in hip hop, for example, but glazing over the true history of our allyship in other communities, that's what I love about what the book does. It gives us a visual and about that. We could see it. Want to go into the 2000s?
Well, can I just
Yeah.
shout out one person? Because when you mentioned music, I will say that one of our favorite things in the book, in addition to that bizarre love triangle piece, was this running feature by Richie Menchavez, Richie Tractivist. Tractivist, you out there somewhere? Yeah, back there. It's the Asian American playlist. And what it does is it takes this one space where I think Asian Americans generally do not know that we are reflected, that we're a part of, and it pulls it out and makes it something you can actually literally put headphones on and listen to. I mean, literally, he actually made Spotify playlists for all these, but he identified all these musicians and the works they did going all the way back into the early history of popular music itself, where we are in fact present. And it just was kind of life-changing for me to know that that could be in my head.
Yeah, it's such a well done. Richie, you understood the assignment. That's what I can say. Like when we said like we want playlists of Asian American musicians, like, and a lot of things that people might not know. I think it'll be surprised, and I mean he surprised all of us, honestly. Yeah, great feature.
2000s?
Okay,
Thousands.
All right. I'm going to choose this paragraph right here. Angry Asian Man is a blog, and I've been at it since before I knew we were calling them blogs. When I do tell people about it, I explain that it's the longest-running, most widely read independent blog devoted to Asian American news, culture, and commentary. I have no idea if this claim is actually true, but
Journalism.
but no one has called me on it yet, so it seems like a safe enough assertion. As for how long I've been doing it, I keep thinking I've done the math wrong, but I've been running Angry Asian Man for over 20 years, which means I've basically been known as Angry Asian Man for longer than I've lived in any one place, longer than I've attended any school, longer than I've held any job. I'm a professional angry Asian man.
Your response.
Okay. So coming back here to San Francisco actually is quite wonderful for this occasion. I started Angry Asian Man. I grew up in the Bay Area and I started Angry Asian Man while I was here after college, back home in Sunnyvale. But also during that time, this is an era where I was working for the Center, what is now known as the Center for Asian American Media. Back then it was called NATA. Which runs what was then called the San Francisco International Asian American Film Festival, now known as CAMFest. A lot of my formative years were spent there. A lot of stuff we write about in the book. My love for all of that, for that scene, was inspired by my time here. A lot of people ask me about why did you start Angry Asian Man? Like what made you so angry? And it was not any one incident that made me angry, and to be honest, I'm not a particularly angry person, at least not emotionally. So, but I think I just wanted to. Here's the thing: people ask, "Why did you start it?" I didn't know I was starting something when I was doing it. Right? You just kind of start doing something, and you like it, and you love it, and people respond to it, and then. And 20 years later, I'm writing a book. Like that's what happens. But I think what Angry Asian Man did, and writing the blog really did, was give me a voice, and it made me realize that I had a voice that I felt like I've been asking, I've been waiting for permission to use like my whole life basically, and then some point you're in the middle of writing this blog and you realize like I don't need permission at all. I'm doing it right now, and it's working, you know. And so I think the response to Angry Asian Man over the years has been so interesting to see, because a lot of Asian Americans also feel this way. Like I've been waiting for permission to feel like this. I've been waiting for permission to say these things. Thank you for articulating the things that I've been on my mind, but I didn't have the language to do it, or I just thought I was not allowed to say this as an Asian American. So it's a weird feeling to be known for this thing and to be celebrated for this thing that just started like in my bedroom, and just because like I just want a place to talk about my feelings, you know, like so it's weird. It's weird.
I'm going to say something. I think for the 2000s, that's when a lot of us were starting to share from our bedrooms, and whoever was going to read it, whoever was going to follow us, we were willing to put it out there. And so I think that it has a huge focus on the internet and how it's shifted us as Asian Americans. So maybe Philip, you could add a little bit to that.
Yeah, I feel like the 2000s, I think the reason why so many people started becoming not just willing, but the technology was finally available. And also culturally, we were shifting towards being open to letting go of a little bit of that privacy and utilizing these tools and the technology. And obviously Wong Fu, you know, came up around that time too. But I think it was always there. It's just we just were never given the ability to you know, circumvent the red tape or overcome some of these gates that were built for decades prior. We finally had a way to say, hey, I'm just going to do it myself, and whoever wants to follow, whoever agrees, can join. And now it's stuff that's so basic and normalized in our daily lives. Oh yeah, I'm going to post a picture, and I'm going to like someone's photo, yada yada. I mean, there was a time I remember when, you know, when Facebook just came out and people didn't want people to see their photos. It was like scary. You remember, like, oh my gosh, privacy's such a big deal. And now people get upset if not enough people saw their photo. Isn't that crazy? Like how much of like a shift we as a society have just kind of like normalized wanting to be heard. But I think for us as for any marginalized communities, when you finally get that chance to have a platform, and you don't even realize you're taking it. And then maybe, you know, as Asian people, we do it more timidly because we're afraid to say outright, hey, I'm going to try this, because we were never brought up to have that voice. So it's a little scary to say I'm going to do it. So we start off just in our bedrooms, just a thing on the side, and then little by little it becomes a 20-year-old blog.
I mean, the story of Asian America's emergence over these 3 decades is actually a story about technology on some level, right? Because I started out launching a magazine that would not have been possible if it wasn't for desktop publishing and personal computers. You know, back when we had like Mac Pluses and we're using, you know, PageMaker and so forth. And then the blog revolution came along, and then YouTube. And now we're in this world of social media and sharing and kind of constant engagement. But over that period of time, you also had this series of cohorts, multiple generations of Asian Americans who came, you know, into America as young kids or were born here, who were raised by loving immigrant parents and high expectation immigrant parents, who, because of that, were very educated in many cases, but also secretly have these passions, these desires to do something other than maybe what was directly expected. And it's all those people who had to tap away in their bedrooms or had to do things under the covers or had to, you know, find other outlets for expression that ended up very slowly over 30 years carving a little hole in the walls that prevented us from accessing everybody else out there. And now in this world of sharing, the reason why Asian Americans punch above our weight in social media, the reason why we can send things trending, why we're seemingly everywhere across the digital space, is because all these people came of age, and all their younger brothers and all their kids came of age. And this is our mainstream media.
Yeah, I still remember the first time I interviewed Hudson when Fresh Out the Boat was about to start. They were doing a press tour, and we got invited to go interview the stars, these kids, right? And Hudson, who's how old was he when he started? Like 8, 9?
9 years old.
9 years
yeah.
old. He was telling me, how many subscribers do you have? I want to be a YouTuber when I grow up. And I'm thinking, you're on TV, bro. I'm trying to get to you. And it's so true. Like this is a new age where the expectations of what mainstream is or what how to build an audience are just completely flipped. Obviously, like there's power is still in certain areas, and the money is definitely still in certain areas. But in terms of barriers to share and barriers to have a voice, that is completely eliminated now, for better and for worse. So it's really interesting to see how Asians have kind of utilized it for themselves.
Let me go back to audience questions because we've got a few, and I want to get to them before
Lightning
we
round.
end the program and end with 2010. What is keeping Asians from being Americans?
I mean, we are Americans. At least those of us who are allowed to, right? I mean, there still are walls around citizenship in this country. There's still immigrant pushback against immigration. But I guess if the question is, why can't we just be Americans? I think that's a question which always comes loaded with all kinds of expectations for what American really means. If the idea is that you come here as an immigrant or you're a child of immigrants and you have to somehow slip the traces of whatever cultural baggage, cultural foundation, cultural anchor you might have had, and then somehow just become as adjacent as possible to the largely white mainstream, well, I mean, that's something that's primarily asked of certain kinds of people who come from places other than, say, Europe, right? Because we have St. Patrick's Day, and we have all these celebrations of white ethnicity that are completely permitted. But when you're Asian, or when you're Latinx, or when you're from some other space which is visibly different, I think there's always that slight tension of like, hey, can you just be a little bit more like over here, and not so much over here? It kind of weirds us out a little bit that you wear that headgear or you eat that food, or that's what in the 90s certainly we grew up with. I think the interesting thing though is by the time you get to the 2010s and my kids, the 2020s, et cetera, that is also flipped, right? The cultural expectation that similarity and acculturation and removing oneself from difference is what makes you American has gone the other way, where now people are like, what makes it cool to be American is that we have so many options of what we can be. But I don't know, that's just what I think.
The question was, why?
What's keeping Asians from being American?
I don't accept the premise of the question. I just. I'll say this, and I say this often. Like, if you go to Asia, nobody in Asia considers themselves Asian, right? Like, there's no category for that. Like, they all consider themselves a member of their own nation of origin, right? Like, or your culture, you're Korean, you're Japanese, you're Indian, and it's not till we come to here, right, where this overarching label is slapped on us, and so we got to figure out what that means. But I don't think that being Asian and then being American are exclusive to one another. Like it's not as though there's some magical flip that happens and then suddenly Asians are American. And I think that, again, if we're trying to define what Asian American means or what Asian means, we also have to define what American means, right? And that is sort of the battle for the soul of that question of what is American. That's we've been waging forever. And before even Asians and Asian Americans entered that conversation and had a stake in that as well. But yes, I have a problem with parsing out what that question even means.
I think the question is actually just what's preventing us from being othered here in America. That's how maybe I am perceiving it, which I don't have an answer to that. I feel like it's a very geopolitical answer that has a very long tail of what needs to happen, or should it even have to happen for us to have to be more accepted in this country. And I don't know. I personally don't ever want to not have Asian or Chinese or Taiwanese not associated with my identity here in America. So I'm not trying to say, hey, only look at me as American. I don't know. That's just me personally, because I'm never going to get away from this. So we might as well talk about it. That's kind of how I see it.
Thank you for this Asian American Almanac. What are your thoughts on our evolving AAPI identity during this time of anti-Asian hate? Maybe also that question, I think the previous question can apply to this as well, because, during COVID, all of a sudden, some of us are not Asian American, we're Asian from elsewhere. How can we collectively come together to not only stop attacks and finally not be afraid?
I mean, I think those are two separate beats, right? The first is about the evolution of what it means to be Asian American in this era. And the second is how do we defend ourselves literally from being pushed off subway platforms or beaten in the streets. And yet they're related on some level. Because one of the things I think that we frequently talk about is that this is not actually a new thing. This whole thing where Asians are being blamed for pandemics or economic duress or loss of jobs. This is something that's happened cyclically over generations and generations and generations. And the stories that are being told, the same ones that Phil mentioned, are being placed upon us, are the ones that keep on coming back. All the way back to like the 1800s, when Chinese first started coming here and turning San Francisco into what it was, there were already the archetypes, there were already the stereotypes. There were Chinese people eating rats and dogs. There were Chinese people who were not clean and who were unassimilable. There were Chinese women who were seen as, exotic, available objects, essentially, right? And those stories were illuminated in editorial cartoons and then eventually translated into war propaganda. And then by the 60s and 70s, were turned into, anti-Japan, anti-economic peril type stories. And all that stuff worked its way into popular culture, right? All the things you saw in cartoons and comic books growing up, for those of us who saw the dark side of Looney Tunes, right? All that stuff is embedded in the cultural imagination of America. So where are we as Asian Americans in this era? We're fighting back by writing back. We are telling stories in order to try as hard as we can to overwrite that collective unconscious that we still have to face every time we go out in the streets. And I think that the thing that's most amazing about this era is that we are finally doing so without subtitles, without explaining ourselves, defiantly, telling stories that are incredibly idiosyncratic and maybe exhausting if you don't actually sit into that particular space. But that's the only way we can actually get people to sit down and look at us as we actually are.
I feel like we definitely struggled with the current environment, even though it has been happening throughout history, as Jeff is, listing out. Like, it does feel different right now. It feels very, very scary. It feels very in our face. It's and maybe that's because of social media, and we are seeing it. We're literally seeing. Imagine seeing just every crime that's out there. You don't have to have like the local newspaper, be delivered to you. You can just see it, right? And it just gets passed around. So it does feel very different. Obviously, writing a book that's so celebratory literally at the same time that all these terrible tragedies are happening is something that I personally have really struggled with, even just promoting the book, right? But then I think, just to what Jeff's saying is that if we don't push back, not necessarily not just physically and not just through our voices, but also just by trying to write our stories and try to control our own narrative and to try to stand up for ourselves in all these different layers, then yeah, we're going to be pushed physically and literally, right? So this is what content, this is what these movements are all about. And so when it comes to what can we do to protect ourselves, that's an answer that I think we're all searching for, and there's not one single answer or way to do it. And I've been struggling with that as well, to be honest. And I think that's what we're all feeling right now, a little bit lost. That's just.
I think a question of what should we as Asian Americans do to prevent these attacks? I don't know. What should I do to prevent myself from being attacked? The question is, I don't know, because I didn't do anything wrong in that situation. I'm not the one who's doing
angry.
Yeah, no. But I'm what is it that I have to do to stop from being attacked, right? You know, so I don't know what measure that has to take for other people to stop seeing me as someone who needs to be attacked. You know, I'm just out here living my life. You know, so that to me is not a question of like something that I have to do, right? Like, I don't know, stop the racism, man. Like that's that's you know, agenda number one.
I will say last thing like that. I think that there is a difference in terms of the tone of how our community is reacting, though, and in a positive way. And I think that we are beating our chests more than what I've noticed in the past before. And again, that's another good side of social media is that we are galvanizing with each other. We are able to support each other. There's also the dark sides of social media where you're seeing another side of the conversation. But anyways, my point is that I think because of all the progress that we've made over the last 30 years, we are feeling more emboldened. We are feeling more entitled to say, hey, we deserve to be here. Hey, we deserve to be upset about this. We're not just some foreigner that's, yeah, like we should be quiet and keep our heads down. That is what a lot of our parents taught us to, keep our heads down, tallest blade of grass gets cut, all that stuff, right? But now we have a new generation or a new mentality because of all the content, all the media, all the progress that we made these last 30 years to say, hey, like, no, we are part of the mainstream. We deserve to be covered. We deserve to be treated equally in terms of how our stories and how our tragedies are covered. So I think that's something that I've definitely noticed, and I think that's a really powerful thing, and I hope it keeps expanding. Yeah.
I love this question, by the way, because it goes back to also the question of being Asian and American. Because my answer would have been like, I mean, I feel like boba is just as American as hamburgers, you know, around here. So as someone, as someone born and raised in the Bay Area, I appreciate your use of boba throughout the book. Can you speak to any discussions you may have had regarding style, terminology, or spelling of foreign words, and how those decisions were made? Question by Kevin.
That's a good question.
It's funny because I think actually even the term boba was something that so we have like 4 pieces on boba in the book for whatever reason, but one of them is looks at the kind of history of how boba became this cultural good, right? That both became mainstream unexpectedly, but also became this sort of gathering point, almost like a symbolic thing that young Asian Americans ended up rallying around culturally in a lot of ways. And one of the things that came out of that was that there's an East-West divide. On the East Coast, it's called bubble tea, and on the West Coast, it's called boba tea. And that difference hinges on a bunch of stuff, but not least, apparently, boba as slang, some people find it uncouth because it supposedly refers to, like, boobs. When boba tea was first invented, in Taiwan, etc., it was popularized as boba tea because, the floating bubbles, whatever. Anyway, so
We'll save that for another show.
we'll save that for another. But this is part of what I think makes some of the stories being told here so interesting. Language matters, right? Symbols matter. And when we talk about what pop culture means and why we call this a pop history, well, it's really not a pop culture history, it's a popular history of Asian America. But by definition, in the last 30 years, a lot of that has really been written in pop culture for that reason.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think a big attitude that we had going into the book was that, we wanted some pieces to be explainers, but not too much. Like, we didn't want to have to explain too much. Like, this is not like your guide to Asian America, like look outside looking in. Like, we're like, this is written by us, like for people who, who live this and know and understand this, So we wanted to have somewhat of an insidery feel. So I felt like, I don't think we ever felt too much need to like over-explain anything. Like, they might not know what this means. So like, forget it. Let's just write it.
Well, I will say this though: there are pieces in the book which we really cherish that are designed to have 2 effects. We call them spaces, right? They're these big fold-out 4-page things where we have this giant illustration of some aspect of Asian American life, and we're literally asking you to step into that. It's annotated by us, so all the things you might have seen across different ethnicities in these spaces, whether it's the Asian American home, Asian American grocery stores, culture festivals, etc. These are all things which, if you were there, if you know, right? If you were there, you'll recognize and feel nostalgic. But if you weren't, well, look, step in, right? We're not going to, we're going to ask you to take off your shoes, but we will invite you to sit down. And that's kind of the approach we took with the book in general.
I want to remind everyone that it's just only 5 years ago that Jimmy Fallon was gagging while drinking boba on his show. So we've made a lot of progress.
Yeah. I'm going to get to 2010s and then the rest of the questions, because I think they're perfect to end the program with before y'all do some book signing. So yes, we have some books out there. If you haven't gotten your copy, today's your lucky day. You can get some and you can get it signed. And if you brought yours, you can get it signed. All right, 2010s.
I'm nervous. I don't know what part you choose.
Grill him. Get him.
We went through this in the green room. We're well prepared. No, I'm just going to stop at I'm going to start at the top. 3 months before the 2010s officially began, I already knew there was going to be something really special about the decade to come. I'm going to stop there because I think that's a good starting point.
So yeah, the story goes on to just say that I was at this concert that my company and another company threw, and it was basically one of the first events, musical events, performances, showcases that brought together YouTube talent. There have been other shows that were just just general talent shows, but this was the first time where it was creators that were on YouTube, on social media, that had built up their own audience from their bedroom, literally singing on their bedroom floors. And we were the first time that we were seeing, hey, will that translate to a live event and a live show? And I remember sitting on the side of the stage. David Choi was singing one of his songs, and he did something that I've only seen at mainstream concerts, which was he stopped singing and just 1,000 people continued singing his song. And it was so incredibly moving to me, and I just thought, this is weird. Like I understand if this was like a radio artist or something, but this guy's just on YouTube, and this is coming from someone that was also just on YouTube. And I'm like, are we allowed to have this? Is this something that can happen in our reality? And I feel like I had a lot of those moments throughout the 2010s where I felt, oh, did we actually get there? Like almost a little bit earlier than I had thought. Obviously, like having these musical artists being able to command thousands of people to know their songs, never being on the radio once, never having a major label promote them. You have Jeremy Lin taking over the world just 2 years into the 2010s. I remember after Yao Ming retired, I was so sad because I first of all, I thought, okay, we're not going to get another Asian superstar for a very, very long time, much less an Asian American superstar. I thought it was going to be decades. And it happened 2 years in. And I'm like, oh, wow. Are we there? And then Crazy Rich Asians, I go into my piece. I stopped at a bus. I literally pulled to the side of the road because I saw a bus stop with the Crazy Rich poster. Why am I getting emotional right now? and again, same feeling. Are we there yet? We actually get to have a poster of us as a mainstream movie. Andrew Yang, whatever you feel about him, 2019, 2020, are we there yet? Also, like all these moments that 2010 kind of started really ramping up of, oh wow, we're reaching this like critical mass, or we're reaching this point where there's a lot of us out there that are doing really cool things and also taking control of our destiny through technology, through building our own audiences, through the different products and platforms, so that we can make our mark on the mainstream. And I just couldn't have imagined that, stuff that I was doing in my bedroom also, or my dorm room, I should say, would be part of this kind of this trend, or I don't even want to say trend because it's just a way of life now. And that's what the 2010s really, really showed. We built on all this progress of magazines, blogs, internet, so to a point where so many people out there, everyone here in this audience has control of their destiny.
I was at that concert that you're talking about.
It was weird, right?
Yeah. That's the moment I remember specifically from that concert too, where David's singing, and then everyone was singing along, and my wife and I looked at each other and we were like, God damn, we're old.
That's how I feel now. If I saw someone do a TikTok dance and everyone doing it, and I have no idea what that TikTok dance is, but okay, I guess it's a thing. But yeah, it was a beautiful, beautiful sight to see, and I'm glad that it was like one of our friends that was able to kind of lead that way.
And more. I mean, meaning there are more pages to write. And so as we wind down on our program here, there is a question here, what is a story or perspective that you each would like to see for page 501?
I mean, we end the book. We actually begin the book with a chapter called Before, and we end the book with one called Beyond. And we dedicate the book to those who come next, right? Because we, in that last chapter, talk about how in the course of writing this book, a lot of things turned on their axis. Initially towards a very dark place, where we felt like this book that was supposed to be about celebration all of a sudden was about preserving things in amber, creating a blueprint in case we had to rebuild, right? That darkness of that early era in which we started writing this book. But then we saw people coming up, this resilient generation of people, this cohort of younger folks who were taking this on the chin, on the one hand, and still standing up. And the biggest thing we saw was that this is not just Asian Americans, but non-Asians as well. There was a new and incredible appetite, a new awareness that there's a world far outside America's borders, and that world was a part of our legacy as Asian Americans and as Americans, period, that we could access all those things because the boundaries that existed between cultures, the same technology that kind of made a lot of our ability to rise was also opening doors. I attended my first BTS concert. Talk about feeling old, right? But I went there and it was incredible. I mean, I'd never seen that many people talk about singing along. Imagine if they were singing along, but they were singing Korean, right? Like phonetic Korean. That's what we saw. We saw this incredible world where 7 Asian guys were creating something aspirational to the point where an entire global army had formed around them and continues to do things much beyond simply going to concerts, but changing the world in small and big ways. We've seen food cultures, we've seen music cultures, we've seen cinema cultures and TV cultures, all of them just changed dramatically by the very fact that the world has become more permeable. And, we didn't even get some of this stuff in the book because it was happening as we spoke. But holy shit, Parasite won a bunch of Oscars, and it's a subtitled movie, and it's a Korean movie, and it's a movie that legitimately, right, was talking about stuff that here in America feels like it's burning down houses, right? But it was there, and we were there. And so I guess what I would say is on page 501, the first page of Rise 2, Rise 2 Furious, whatever it's going to call, we would be talking about the many things that feel like they have finally pivoted away from simply focusing on ourselves in some ways as a minority fraction of America and maybe part of a global majority.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say something controversial here to the three of us. I can also imagine where there is not a need for a second book. And what I mean by that is when we were doing all the research for all these pieces, there's so much content in here. It was heartbreaking that you would have a 3-hour-long conversation with someone incredibly inspiring and for the movement and for the progress, and then have to parse it down to 2 pages, right? Each piece in here could be its own book. And I think the reason why this book works at this period of time right now is because no one has put together everything all, sure, you can go on the internet and find, articles and snippets, to put together the information here. But in one solid piece, that's what we've done here, right? But perhaps in the future, we will just have more books that are about each individual topic, and we're allowed to have longer conversations, and we're going to be able to go deeper and dive deeper. Obviously, we could only scratch the surface because no one had done it before, and we had to, like you're saying, preserve it. Otherwise, it would be forgotten, right? But now we've done it, and now we've, we're saying, we've reached this inflection point where maybe it's okay for us to just have more of our stories that are just an entire book. And I think we're seeing that. And obviously, yeah, maybe Jeff will have a great idea of how Rise Too Furious, Ian he'll bamboozle us back in. But I think one thing we joke about too is that maybe ideally, you know, we're not waiting another 30 years. We'll have enough content from just 5 years. We'll have enough content for maybe just a couple years, right? So I would love to see just anyone like open this book and say, hey, that should be its own book. Or maybe the creators themselves will see it and say, hey, I'm going to actually write my own book about this. And then we'll all get to enjoy that.
I'm with Phil, who talked about we must tell our own stories, and there's a question here I think that will be appropriate for the last 60 seconds for you to briefly just either agree or not. But this question is great. It's about institutionalizing this effort of us moving forward and telling our own stories. So who do you think, who or what organization will do this after you?
I'm very curious, Phil.
I honestly don't know. It's up to everybody, honestly. Like, here's the thing. Like, the burden of writing this book, I was like, I honestly wish it did not fall to us. You know what I mean? I wish that this had been happening all along, and then someone else had been institutionalizing and canonizing this kind of work. But maybe that's what we're headed towards, I think. Like, my answer to the previous question is actually, I am looking forward to Asian American mediocrity, in that not everything has to matter so much, right? That we have to put it in this book that's so special. And what if Asian Americans could just be comfortable with what we're doing now and the accomplishments that we have, and that are not everything has to hang on the success. The success of this will make or break Asian America. This one film, this one book, whatever. I'm looking forward to a time where we can just be ourselves and be happy with this, be content in the things that we produce. And maybe it'll fail, maybe it'll succeed, maybe it'll break barriers, or maybe it'll just be the next thing that goes down by the wayside. But I hope that we can have sort of a culture making that is not so dependent on the one, on the chosen one. You know?
I can't wait till your daughter comes back with a report card and said, Dad, you said Asian mediocrity.
Don't worry, my son has already played that card. Trust me. Roll tape.
You guys had that. Yeah, he said it.
But on that note, I mean, so that whole notion of Asian mediocrity and this feeling that somehow every single thing we do has to be a giant success, or at least not embarrassing, right? Or it'll destroy us, salt the earth for decades, right? That whole Margaret Cho thing, the coda to that, the thing that kind of came back at me and at Asian America is that a couple decades later, there was another, finally, Asian American show. It did, in fact, star unaccountably my son, Hudson Yang, as Eddie, and all of a sudden that whole notion of karma just was driving right at my face. And was this going to be another opportunity for us to boldly go into pop culture, crash, burn, and then again have nothing, right? And Fresh Off the Boat, when it came out, it was surprisingly fresh, again, per its name, and different, but also familiar, right? It carved out the space where it felt like Asian American content could be both different and specific, and maybe defiantly so in some ways, without explanations. But that specificity actually was what made it universal, right? And the reason I bring it up actually in the context of mediocrity is because when we were all waiting for it to come out, when we were all carrying it on our shoulders, doing events like this, watch parties, like I said, trying our best to make sure that eyeballs were on this thing. One of the things that Phil did was he created these, a series of sort of post-show conversations about each episode for the entire season called Fresh Off the Show. And at the very first talk back after the first episode, he kind of coined this term that even today I feel carves out the entire territory of this feeling of pressure we have as a community to not have stuff suck, right? Which I'll let you talk to.
Yeah, well, it was coined by me, my wife, Joanna Lee, and Jenny Yang. It was before the first episode aired, and we were like, what is this anticipation or this feeling that we feel like oh, please don't suck, right? Like, it doesn't have to be good, but please don't suck. And that term we came up with was the rep sweats, the representation sweats. That feeling you get, we're like, oh my gosh, oh, there's an Asian? Oh my, okay, please be good, please be good. You know, they're like, it's the rep sweats.
I'm glad I got the rep sweats right before I walked up in here. Everyone, I think that we all can agree that this wasn't mediocre. We love it. It was the greatest thing. It is the greatest thing. Rise. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for Jeff, Philip, and Philip.
Oh, can we take a picture?
Thank you
with
so
you
much
guys
for-
before you
for-
leave.
Oh, before you leave,
Oh.
We
House
want to
lights?
come up here too.
House lights?
Yeah, because this is kind of cool to us. We have who has the long arm?
Here, I got lanky arms.
everybody's.
All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Nice. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Book signings are out.